have all our generosity. So we'll have 5 minutes of speech for the partial finals, and I wish you guys the very best. The reply speech, the time is not changing. Yeah, so let's have the first affirmative speaker.
This House would ban all animal testing. My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. This being a policy resolution, both teams are burdened to give us an action and who is most likely going to make that action and what pushes them to make that action, and at the end of the day, what is the benefit of that action, right? In this debate, we're most likely going to have things like government to make this kind of action, right? Why do they have the incentive to make that action? That is basically on the nature of animals and the value they have to society or the government at the end of the day. What do animals look like, right? Animals are animals look like sentient beings in society, right? Animals that are beings that are able to feel, beings that are able to have specific values, right? At the end of the day, there is an incentive for the government to protect these particular interests for these kinds of animals at the end of the day, right? But also secondly, because these animals have some sort of value towards the government, there is an incentive to do that. What kind of value of that, right? We think that there is taxation that exists with there's some taxation that exists with people rearing animals, making them, or when an individual must pay some sort of tax when they're able to move these animals around or something of that sort, right? We think that when people have more of these animals, or we have a larger population of these kinds of animals, we are most likely going to have benefit the government at the end of the day, right? But also secondly, on the criticism the government is most likely to face when you don't advocate for the animal rights at the end of the day, right? We have bigger organizations think that the UN that value things like animal rights at the end of the day, right? Because Uganda, or a country, is most likely to be part of this kind of organization, it would not want to get that kind of criticism at the end of the day, right? It will still want to get things like funding, right, or something of that sort, right? But secondly, when a country is most likely to be part of an organization, it has the obligation to care about its objectives at the end of the day, because it still wants to be part of that kind of organization, right? So we think that it has much more of an incentive to do that, right? But also on banning, right? What amounts to banning? We're most likely going to ban something, but all it has some level of harm it creates in society, right? The reason why smoking is most likely going to be banned is because it has some certain level that exists in society. It is most likely going to contribute to carbon concentration. Because we want to reduce on the carbon concentration, we're most likely going to want to ban smoking and reduce the rate at which carbon is being concentrated in the environment, right? So applies to banning of testing, right? What happens here on the nature of testing, right? Testing does not necessarily mean that you're testing them for medical means or something of that sort. We do acknowledge that good that comes from testing, but the harm that comes with testing makes it amount to banning it at the end of the day. What does that look like, right? With testing, because particular individuals have that liberty to essentially test them, and then that in the name of we want to make tests for medicine or something of that sort, they most likely have the ability to tell you that they want to use them for things like lab rat or something of that sort, right? But secondly, with this testing, it looks like you intoxicate these kinds of animals or something of that sort, right? Why is that something that is bad? When you have a lot of animals being tested with different toxins, you're most likely going to lose the population of that animal because you're most likely going to lose the population of that animal because you're testing it continuously or something of that sort, right? I showed you at the beginning, why do we think that population is something that is important to the government and the people at the end of the day, right? But secondly, with testing, you're most likely going to want to create things like mutation or something of that sort, right? The incentive for an individual to most likely carry out this kind of testing is something that is bad at the end of the day, right? We do acknowledge that the benefit that exists with the testing, but the harm that comes with it are things that amount to it being banned, right? We think that on that particular matter, Senate Position needs to tell us why with the existing harm that comes with testing, why do they think it should not be banned at the end of the day, right? Why do they think that it's something that should not be banned? Why do they think that it is something that should not be banned at the end of the day, right? But then secondly, Basically, let you tell us what they're most likely going to have a counter principle. You should give us an analysis on to why they think, and everyone is most likely going to buy into that kind of principle, and then on to like why is that something like important at the end of the day, right? But secondly, they need to look at these animals with an intrinsic value and not necessarily looking at them as like, things that are materials, right? What happens on their side is that animals are viewed in a perspective that they are only materialistic or something of that sort, right? You look the whole idea that animals have that kind of interest, right? At the end of the day, you don't maximize the advancement of human rights, right? What happens when you legalize testing, you're most likely going to legalize individuals to like carry out things like mutations because they have the ability to like have that blanket over them so that they're not able to there's no question towards them as to when they're most likely going to be testing this kind of animals, right? Before I proceed, any POI?
Protected time, proceed.
Anyways, because of the existing of the legalization of this kind of testing, you're most likely going to provide that kind of blanket, right? What happens on side opposition is that they need to give us a reason why they think that blanket is something that is justified at the end of the day. But secondly, in change of context or something of that sort, right? The reason why those kinds of testing needs to happen because we had a lot of new diseases that existed. But right now in status quo, we have already diseases that we know you can look at symptoms or something of that sort, or like signs, right? If that cow is bringing out blood, you know that it has this kind of like disease, right? What happens on their side is there's no reason for like that testing at the end of the day, right? There's no like importance of that testing. I beg to rest.
Thank you. First affirmative speaker. We will welcome the first negative speaker to open the case of negative.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Iman Namuli, and I'm here to oppose the motion that states this House would ban all animal testing. Now, banning means to put a halt. That means to stop something. And on our side of the House, we aim at regulation in a way that promotes animal rights and welfare. We believe that if banning all animal testing occurs, the following would happen: delayed medical progress, increase human risk, economic consequences, no viable alternatives in many fields, shortage of life-saving treatments, and failure in economic and research. Now, for the first point, delayed medical progress. As we all know, animal testing is vital when it comes to medicine, right? In pharmacies, in pharmacy labs and whatnot, we use these animals to test. Yes, and we are here to advocate for animal rights, but what we want to do is ban the labs, ban the companies and corporations that harm these animals in a negative way. We are not saying that we ban all these animals because it's going to delay medical research. It's going to, for example, polio, the polio vaccine. We got this polio vaccine by using these animals for testing. And the animals that were used for testing came out okay. They came out fine. They were later put back into nature and their natural habitats. We have the COVID-19 vaccine. The COVID-19, before it came to us humans, they used animals because at the end of the day, they use these animals that have a similar genetic makeup to us as humans ourselves. So if we ban all animal testing, how are we going to achieve these things? How are we going to, it's going to delay the medical infrastructure at large, because pharmacy labs use these things. For those who do biology and chemistry, pharmacological labs, that's where people are going to be working. If you want to ban all animal testing, how are you going to go to these labs and attain these new medicines? We know cancer, right? Every single time we're getting a new cancer because we generally have these cancer cells. So if we ban all animal testing, how are we going to then find, granted, in the late 90s and early 90s, humans were used for medical research. And by this is in historical books whereby people were taken off streets illegally. The children on streets, homeless people, dead bodies were moved from the ground for medical research. This is why they resorted to animals with similar genetic makeups. We're not saying that all the testing, some testing facilities may be bad, that is true, but not all of them are. Not all these animals that have been used for testing have come out in a harmful manner. Not all of them are. The next point, increased human risk. Now remember, these animals are used, they are tested to implement organ transplant, right? Such as the heart, liver, kidney. were able to transplant organs from one human to another because of these animals. And there have been successful results. These animals were later such as monkeys, humans and monkeys have a similar genetic makeup. They came up with these results by using monkeys. These monkeys were later tested on, fed, and later taken back to their natural habitats. There's something called the 3 R's. The 3 R's is replacement, reduce, and refine. They bring these animals in, test them, replace them, refine them. Simply meaning they test, after testing, they wait for them to heal, and they're later taken back into their natural habitats. If you ban all animal testing, how are we going to be able to get these things? Someone may come up and say, what other alternative methods would you then suggest, right? We have computer simulation. As we know of today, technology has advanced to great levels. If we're able to use we reduce on the animal testing, right? Reduce on the way these animals are being tested on, and maybe, let's say, not fully go through the entire testing, but partial, because there are some partial surgeries whereby you'll need to go for a first surgery and then a second. If the second surgery is risky, because remember, we're looking at these animal rights, right? If the second surgery is risky, you're able to get your computer and create a simulation of what could happen. Why not use such alternatives? Why ban all animal testing when you have another alternative? Thank you.
Thank you, first negative speaker. I'll welcome the second affirmative speaker to extend the case.
My time begins in 3, 2, 1. Chair, I think the most beautiful thing that I get from this guy's case is the whole idea of there's alternatives in place, but people simply do not take them, or because animals don't matter, but also because animals do not deserve to live on this world, right? That is like the assumption that comes from their case. Even in the presence of alternatives, they still feel like animals deserve to suffer and all that, because, well, animals don't have a life, right? Like, animals are not that relevant. Like, animals are not as important as human beings, so they deserve to be tested on, even in the presence of alternatives, right? Notice, they themselves acknowledge that there's very many alternatives in status quo, things such as simulation, technology, and, cell-based tests and all those things, right? But the reason as to why human beings don't necessarily take on to those measures is because they don't think that animals do have rights as human beings not to be tested on, right? Notice, they need to acknowledge that even in as much as they don't look like us, they also have families, but also have sentient, right? That's what, despite all the instrumental value that we attach to them, they also have intrinsic value, right? But also they also have rights such as not being exposed to things such as suffering and all those sorts. The reason as to why we do not take human beings to those tests is because we feel like they are bad, right? Or probably because they could be problematic to those human beings, right? The alternative on our side looks like we do not take animals as well, because animals too have no right to suffer, because also animals necessarily have a right to life and also a right to freedom from suffering, right? The side of the house that they then argue for is a world where even when we have alternatives, we still look at animals, right? But also secondly, they do not acknowledge the whole idea of exploitation that happens of these animals. Notice that things such as regulation have already happened. There have been so many laws to regulate what happens in these laboratories, but because people do not care, or because governments do not necessarily implement this particular sort of things, then most likely that sort of suffering still exists in those labs, because people don't have access to those labs anyways, right? The alternative we then feel like is better is something like banning, right? What if you think that banning is much better? Because those animals don't get to suffer anyway. Notice, they cannot come and claim, we're going to have delayed medical research and all that, because there's alternatives, right? That is something that we think we both argue for. So the debate then narrows down to, who protects animals better, right? Notice that to the extent that these people cannot come and justify why animals, unlike human beings, deserve to suffer, then they cannot take home this debate, right? But also secondly, on moral grounds, notice that the ability of animals to be the ability to protect animals should not be based off what humans think, right? But it should be based off their ability to suffer as well, right? We then feel like we have a moral obligation to protect them too. Notice that it is only fair that what you do not want to be done to you, you do not do to another person. Notice that when you beat a cat, it is most likely going to cry. So the same pain that you don't want a human being to go through when they're testing them is the same pain that you don't want those like animals to go through at the end of the day, right? Notice that we think that we live in a world where animals too have rights just like human beings. I'll take you.
Honorable, when you say testing, we all know that when you go to a hospital, you're tested before they give you actual medicine. Do you feel pain? Do you suffer?
Chair, I think the kind of testing that happens in labs is not the kind of testing that happens in hospitals, for crying out loud. The thing is as simple as, what happens in labs is they're going to experiment on your cells and probably inject you with all kinds of medication that they think is good or bad, right? What happens in hospitals is different. So the kind of laboratories that we look at in this contest are like what Aisha tells you already, not the kind of like testing that happens in hospitals. So that is ironic, but also something that we don't have to like debate on in this particular round, right? But also secondly, we think that on the whole idea of like, like the whole idea of us being like, able to like have empathy, but also like the ability of human beings to like put themselves in that like in the same shoes as these animals. Notice that we think that both worlds agree that animal rights are like something that we should care about, but also things that are important, right? To that extent, feel like whatever humans don't want to happen to them does not deserve to happen to the animals, right? Like I already tell you, morally, the ability of us to like protect animals should not be based off like animals being animals, but their ability to suffer as well, right? So to that extent, like to the extent that we feel like there's already alternatives in place, we don't think that there's still need for things such as lab testing on animals, because there's alternatives in status quo. Unless they can come and prove that those alternatives cannot work, we then feel like there's no relevancy or significancy of lab testing on animals, because there's alternatives, right? Unless they can come and prove that these alternatives do not work, we then feel like we are justified to ban them. Why? Because they no longer have like necessity, but also secondly, they don't have relevancy. To the extent that whatever we can get from like testing animals can be gotten from using other measures that are not so bad as testing on animals. Because notice, you're not going to tell me that people care about monkeys and all the monkeys are going to come out alive. Like it is evident. Even during high school practicals, like the rats kind of die, right? So you cannot tell me that where actually that sort of torture is made worse, that these like monkeys are going to survive anyways, right? We then feel like that is something that is like very ironic, but also something that is very unrealistic, because those animals do die from those tests, right? But also secondly, by virtue that you do not want humans to go through that that sort of testing, we then feel like even animals don't deserve to like go through that sort of testing. I beg to rest.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All protocol observed. We oppose the motion this House would ban all animal testing. I would like to echo that our stance against this motion is not in disregard of animal rights and well-being and welfare, but rather looking for more and setting up regulatory rules and ways and safer ways we can test these animals and safer ways we can get medication for only and only medical research. First point, animal testing has led to life-saving treatments. Through animal testing, we have been able to get life-saving treatments for big diseases in the world, diseases that are affecting every single person in the world, diseases that are almost in every single country in the world, diseases like polio, diseases like cancer, diseases like making vaccines for different diseases. And these vaccines are used on babies. These vaccines are used on human beings to save these human beings from these dangerous diseases. All this has been got from animal testing. Animal testing helps humans and helps animals as well, because animal testing is not done only for humans, but it's done for also animals, like diseases like euranthia that's faced by animals. The vaccine and the medicine for euranthia was got through animal testing. Please.
There's alternatives to status quo, but people do not utilize them because they think animals deserve to suffer.
That's why we are saying that we should look for better ways, safer ways to test these animals. We should look and set up a body that can regulate and see the risks in testing these animals, and if it's totally safe, it should proceed. Animal testing has led to economic and medical research. Medical research has been done through this animal testing for the future and for now. Problems faced by so many people in the world and problems that could be faced in the future. Viruses, different kinds of germs, plasmodiums, have all this treatment that has saved so many lives in the world has been got through animal testing. As the second speaker told us, the assumption from the opposition case is animals should continue to suffer. We are not saying animals should continue to suffer, but we are saying that we should look for safer ways, better ways, ways without risks, to be able to save these animals, to be able to protect these animals, because these animals have rights as well. The welfare of these animals matters, and through this we can be able to achieve the right goal. So we oppose the motion that this house would ban all animal testing, but not all animal testing. We should sit down and regulate and see the best ways to test these animals. From the first speaker of the proposition said not all animals are tested for medical purposes. Then we should set up a body in different countries with the governments of different countries to be able to set only and only for medical purposes. And if it's not medical purposes, it should be banned. As I said, medical testing is not only done for animals, but it's not only done for humans, but it's done for animals as well. Animals have so many diseases that they are facing. There are so many diseases for animals in the world, and through this we can be able to achieve different medicines, different vaccines for these animals, so that they can also heal from what's killing and extincting different types and different species of animals in the world. Is that time now? Is my time still on? Thank you. I rest my case.
Okay, I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Just on motion burden, right? Team affirmative have a burden to prove beyond reasonable doubt why things like then testing animals amounts to things like banning, right? But then secondly, it means that team opposition has an inherent burden to prove beyond reasonable doubt why, with the existence of the harms that then actually occur within testing, it is more justifiable for us to continue testing these animals. Notice what we tell you from our side of the house is that things like regulatory things have already happened, and this looks like their biggest claim, right? They tell you that instead of like banning things like texting, we should go ahead and then actually promote things like regulating, right? But we tell him from our first speech, right, where things like regulations don't actually are most likely not going to be able to work in the debate is because these things have like existed, right? But the reason as why people don't pay attention to them is because they have less incentive to care about animals, right? Notice the nature of animals. Like, animals look like sentient beings, right? It inherently means that animals have the ability to feel, right? Animals have the ability to like have emotional attachment to things, right? At a particular point in time, you're most likely going to test them. You more likely actually expose them to a lot of harm, right? That actually necessarily means that you're actually more likely going to harm them, right? But also on the idea on why regulation that is more likely not going to work is because people don't have an incentive to necessarily care about animals, right? The analysis that proves this is how they're able to tell you how they use these animals in labs, right? Because they want to create vaccines for like humans, right? Well, we think this is actually very dangerous, right? We think because the existence of that argument also shows you why it is actually dangerous for us to necessarily test animals, right? The existence of us testing animals, but not humans, right? Already proves you that there is some harm that exists within testing already, right? This is why they don't indirectly test humans to create their medicine, right? They go out to test animals, right? It extends to show you that there is already harm that exists within you testing animals, right? This is why in the end of the day we think that testing is necessarily bad, right? But we think that debate stems out to the whole idea of necessarily testing. What testing looks like in the side of the house is that they want to limit it to only medical purposes, right? Why we think this is controversial is that, notice, we think in the end of the day it is going to necessarily be overshadowed by its basic interest, right? We think in the incentive that people want to necessarily test animals for like medical purposes, in the end of the day it stems out to necessarily using these animals like lab rats, right? It stems away to using these animals like sort of like then lab experiments, experiments. Where that becomes dangerous, is that in as much as this necessarily happens, the extent to which we lose animals now becomes actually significantly higher, right? Because within that process, you're able to lose a lot of animals, right? When you don't actually test them with the right medicine. But secondly, the impact that spills out, like the harm that you create while testing these animals, is much more not justified, right? Because we tell you from our setup that these animals have the feelings, right? Have the ability to be able to experience all the things that human beings necessarily experience, right? We think it would be fair if you want to create medicines for human, you necessarily go ahead and test humans, right? If it's actually entirely necessarily effective anyways in the end of the day. What our side of the house tells you, is that you don't test these animals, right? Because we think at a particular point in time you do this, you're over likely then go to extend to things like using them as rub rights, right? The impact on that is that these animals lose their lives, is that they experience pain, is that you actually separate away these animals from their loved one, just like the way you do to humans, right? Why we think this is essentially important is because the same impacts that happen when you test humans are the likely impacts that are going to happen when you test animals, right? Why we think this essentially becomes bad is that you then actually lose a lot of animals, but also impacts a lot of pain on them taken.
If safe ways are created for these animals to be tested that do not harm them in any way, to find medication for both animals and humans, does this make it safe to test animals?
I find that POI myopic because already the existence of safe ways in society is in existence, right? We have things like technology, we have things like simulation, we have things like cell testing, right? But the reason that's why you don't do that is because you think animals are not important, right? I mean, like safe testing is already happening in Celesco, right? If there is a better way, you could necessarily examine the diseases that happen with animals without initially testing them, right? But the reason that's why you don't do that is because you don't value them as like you don't value their existence just like the way you value yours, right? So the way up on this debate is like very simple, right? We think the biggest metric that we want to necessarily achieve in this debate is animal rights, right? What we're able to show you from opposition, right, is that side of the house is necessarily able to now necessarily destroy the whole idea on why animals exist in the first place, right? Because they infringe on their rights, but secondly, they inflict a lot of pain on them, right? In that side of the house, we're able to show you that when we don't test, right, you're able to now necessarily able to like uplift this sort of like rights. But then secondly, there are other regulatory ways that they can necessarily use to necessarily achieve what they want to necessarily achieve. That is basically medication, right? We tell you about things like technology, we tell you about things like simulation, but in the end of the day, we tell you these are safer ways you can be able to examine animal diseases without directly necessarily testing them. Notice that the danger that happens within testing is that you're most likely going to be able to lose animals, but then secondly, you're going to be able to separate them from their loved ones, and in the end of the day, you're able to actually inflict pain in the end of the day, right? Which is actually contradicting to the basic interest of their rights in the end of the day. That is why we don't actually want to consent with that side of the house. In the side of the house, we are able to now necessarily be able to examine the diseases without directly actually injuring these animals, without directly necessarily inflicting pain on them, which we think it is the basic interest of their rights in the end of the day. Back to rest.
Good afternoon. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. On that side of the house, they tell us about these alternatives, and our first speaker came and told us how these alternatives are inefficient. That's why on our side of the house, we vouch for regulation. These other alternatives on their side of the house would not be there without our side that is regulating this animal testing, that is making it safer. And on that side of the house, they claim that we do not care about animal rights, we do not care about what. This animal testing not only happens for humans, but also happens for animals. It is there to help animals. It is there to get for them medical help. There are animals that suffer from problems like cancer and they need their parts amputated. On our side of the house, when animal testing is regulated, these animals will come and they will test prosthetics on them that function for them. And then, on our side of the house, our second speaker stated that our aim is more on regulation than banning because animals suffer from diseases like Orantia, which you guys fail to recognize, because Orantia is a disease that animals suffer from when they're in packed places and they suffer from mental diseases. On our side of the house, we believe that these animals will be taken away, examined, tested, and we'll find a solution for them. On our side of the house, we are not only working to help the humans, we're also working to help the animals as well. On their side, they believe that if animal testing continues, mutation will continue. Currently, mutation is illegal. It is regulated by the World Health Organization and the UN. It is not allowed. And on our side of the house, that's the same thing that would apply since we'll be regulating right? And we'll be helping these animals not to go through those things. No, thank you. Well, they failed to give us alternatives except the cell studies that they talked about. What are they going to get from those cells? That's animal testing as well. It is something that we're going to try and regulate. It is going to be very little. You are just coming here to support us as well. Well, they also failed to consider the economic constraint that banning animal testing is going to put on. Sorry, my bad. That animal testing is going to put on us. Our first speaker came and talked about it. If animals are not tested, it's going to cause economic constraint on people like farmers who are going to be waiting for vaccines for their animals, treatment for their animals, and other things. Secondly, our first speaker also talked about human medical need will be delayed. If animal testing is completely banned, some vaccines would not be gotten, and hence there will be people dying. There will be some diseases also get communicable from humans to animals. So essentially, we'll be harming animals at the end of the day. So, what does our side prove? What does our side bring to this case? We prove that we care about animal rights through animal testing, and we can help them if there is animal testing continued. On their side of the house, they ban animal testing. Everyone is at stake. Humans are at stake. Animals are at stake. No one is going to be helped. But for us, we aim at helping everyone, including animals and humans. Thank you so much. I raise my case.
Thank you very much. We'll receive the reply speech from opposition to close the opposition case.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All protocol observed. We oppose the motion. This House would ban all animal testing. Our stance against this motion is not done in disregard of animal rights or advocacy for animal welfare, but rather for more regulated and better ways of testing animals. From the third speaker from the proposition side, he said that things like regulating have already been there, but we're here today to debate a policy motion. We want this regulating to become a policy, to become a law, to become a rule for all laboratories around the whole world. And through making this a policy and making these regulations policies, we will be able to get the goal of protection of these animal rights while in animal testing. Animal testing is done for both animals and humans, brought up to get medications and to have medical research for both animals and humans. So if we ban all animal testing, how are we going to treat human beings? How are we going to treat animals? This is going to lead to mass death around the whole world. The case of proposers is built off animal suffering and pain inflicted on these animals while testing. But through making these regulations, making these laws that labs have to follow, and through the use of anesthesia that is used on these animals while they are being tested, these animals will not suffer from pain. These animals will be safe from a risk-free treatment. These animals will be able to be protected in these laboratories if this is implemented. Thank you. We rest our case.
Thank you. We welcome the affirmative reply speaker to close the affirmative case.
My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. The main thing that side opposition keeps on arguing for is that, we're most likely going to have regulation, right? This being a policy resolution, they need to tell us how they are most likely going to do that regulation, right? Failure to do that, the alternative then looks like they're supporting status quo at the end of the day. What is wrong with status quo, right? Individuals do not care about these animals. They do not view them as sentient beings, right? That means there is no incentive whatsoever for them to value that kind of regulation at the end of the day, right? There's no sort of change that exists on their side, no level of analysis where they show us that, this is how the regulation is most likely going to look like, right? But also secondly, they tell us that, in context, we already have things like alternatives, things like cell-based testing, right? That is, so you're most likely going to test the cells of animals that have the same DNA or something of that sort, right? We don't get reasons why they think those alternatives should not be something. We don't get reasons why they think the individuals are very less likely to buy into those alternatives, right? What happens when in fast speech, I tell you that with the existence of the liberty that individuals are able to test these animals, they have some level of like blanket or something of that sort, right? With that blanket, they're able to misuse that kind of right to like test these kinds of animals. That you say they're able to like carry out mutations at the end of the day, right? There's no incentive for them to essentially like carry out those tests. There's no incentive for them to carry out like tests that are much safer for these kinds of animals, right? But secondly, this event is aimed to find out who's most likely going to maximize animals' right? What happens on their side is that they view animals as materialistic beings, right? They don't value that principle of like these animals being sentient beings at the end of the day, right? That is to say that they don't care how they feel they don't care about how they feel, but they view them as a material for like human satisfaction or something of that sort, right? I beg to rest.
All right. Thank you, debaters, for such a wonderful debate. We wish all of you the very best, and we hope to see both of you in the final, if it is possible. Yeah, the judges will remain here as the rest of you get out and will deliberate.